I've got like a two-part question. First of all, why would you say that independent media is so significant in this day and age, right here, right now, in this specific climate, in this specific context, country, everything? And secondly, why do you think that Sludge Mag departs a little bit from how I said before, when something is independent media, it tends to be politically neutral?
To answer the first question in terms of why it's important, I think people will understand better if they think about independent media within the prism of public ownership. That's a better way to look at it to make this point. So at the moment, we've seen with water companies dumping sewage into the ocean or astronomical profits for energy companies. This is how organisations run under capitalist principles. So under capitalist principles, capital is the main purpose of how an organisation is run. Media companies are exactly the same. So if you watch a TV show or news show or current affairs show, I think the general public thinks that the point of these shows is to inform them. It's not. So any company that exists in the UK, because we have a capitalist economy, is run by capitalist principles, i.e. to make money. So if we think about how a media company makes money, through YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it is, virality is how you make money. You need people clicking on things and responding to things. Whether you're actively engaged or learning anything or getting anything useful is kind of secondary. What you need is for people to have a really emotive response to something. So if you think when Piers Morgan used to be on Good Morning Britain and you'd have, I don't know, one person who's very pro Winston Churchill and one person who's super anti Winston Churchill, or a trans rights activist and a TERF, for example, or a racial equality campaigner versus a racist. There's no reason conversation between these two people would actually inform you of anything. The point is to get a soundbite, to get an explosive argument, to get something that gets everyone talking so that it trends on the timeline. Then said companies can demonstrate to potential advertisers their level of engagement to charge higher tariffs for ad revenue.
Tactic of outrage, right?
Exactly, yeah. You can just commodify outrage. That's why shows that have people shouting all the time tend to do the best and have the most money, etc., etc. So Sludge Mag offers something different in the sense that because we're not a corporation or don't take money from lobbyists or political parties or anything like that, our only kind of duty is to actually informing people. I think a lot of people assume that's what media is, which I can see why people would feel that way, but it isn't. So the fact that the platform actually does serve that purpose is what differentiates us.
Obviously, you just explained to us now that the main purpose of Sludge Mag is to deliver the news, but it's not just that you deliver news, you deliver news in line with, as you said before, a certain political subjectivity. Why do you think that that's important to do? Why have you made Sludge Mag why have you designed it that way?
I think all media delivers things from a political subjectivity. I think the fact that
even though they pretend not to, right?
Yeah, I think the fact that Sludge Mag is transparent about that is maybe what differentiates it slightly. I can't imagine why someone would start a media company if they didn't have some sort of political subjectivity, unless, as I often mentioned, it was just for money by saying outrage to sell or get ad revenue.
Obviously, at its core, Sludge Mag, in the name, it's a magazine, it's an online magazine, essentially. But I would have to say, I think you'd agree that Instagram has played a key part in the what's it called, spreading and decimation of this information, of this political message, of the news, etc. And I would say that's how the main tool through which it's enjoyed success. So how has that been for you? Because obviously Instagram in itself isn't perfect. I think I would argue that it's a flawed platform. But how has it been for you to, obviously that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd say the main tool through which you reach people, but then obviously you're aware that like it's not all roses.
I'd say Instagram was to begin with, and it's still our hero platform, but in terms of engagement, our website has a lot of readers as well. In terms of how I deal with it personally, I don't really pay much mind to it because, as you say, it's just a platform. Before running Sludge Mag, my primary creative output was just being a fashion photographer. And as photographers, we've always known that whether it be Tumblr, which was the primary platform for photographs for a while, or Instagram now, or perhaps TikTok in a few years when people work out how to make still images really work on TikTok, the platforms that you put your content out on aren't, you know, not that they're not important, but they're not the objective, or they're just a tool for disseminating information. I don't think it's healthy to think about the platforms in of themselves that much.
That's very interesting, actually, that you say that, like, because obviously us as a platform, and we do share news from time to time, and other similar platforms, a lot of what they will say is kind of how much they are forced to think about media platforms and how to play the media platforms. And so it's interesting to hear you say that you actually didn't pay too much mind to it. But I guess also it's testimony to the Sludge Mag's output and how organic that growth has been. You know, the fact that you haven't had to manufacture or orchestrate too much of the success and the engagement and stuff like that.
Yeah, and of course, by no means would I pretend that Instagram hasn't been massively beneficial for the platform. Of course, it has. But I think the success of the magazine comes from people actually learning from more nuanced political discourse more than technological affordances of Instagram. You know, every social media platform becomes obsolete at some point, whether it's Pixo or Bebo.
High five.
I mean, Facebook's not obsolete, but in terms of how much we use it now compared to when we were teenagers, the same will happen on Instagram. So I think you just need to make sure whatever you're creating has substance, independent of being successful on one platform.
I would say, like, just while we're talking about like the secret winning formula, I personally, I would say, like, the reason why I think Sludge Mag has been so successful, and the thing about Sludge Mag that I personally appreciate so much is the way the news is conveyed. As we were talking before, like every news outlet has a political orientation and subjectivity. It's just that they pretend not to, and oftentimes they're very disingenuous with the way that they might convey a news story. Whereas Sludge Mag is very transparent, is very much like, this is where we stand on the spectrum, this is what our values are, and then you don't shy away from presenting the news in a way that exposes that truth, that political truth, right? I really enjoy the equivalences that you draw with like the current political like context of the world. So I would say that that's what's so refreshing, that's what's so different about Sludge Mag. It's something that might in other news outlets be presented as a self-contained news story, but on Sludge Mag will tell you what the historical and political contingencies are of whatever news story they're conveying to you. And that's what really makes people learn, is to be able to connect the dots like that, you know?
And I think as well, doing it in a way which is easily accessible and understandable. It's always
Meme format. Meme
yeah.
format, that's the winning formula.
But even when it's not in a meme, it's condensed, but not it's not conformed in any way in the sense of, or curtailed in any way, in terms of having to cut out really important contextual points, etc. It's always all there, but in a way that's so much easier to understand and so much more enjoyable to understand, as opposed to having to switch on the news, I would say.
Now, I'm glad it comes across that way, and I think that's to give Instagram some credit. I feel like I need to backtrack a bit because I'm making it sound like I don't like the platform at all. But I suppose the nature of a platform where you know people scrolling by quickly is that you innately tailor things to be accessible. And as I said, accessibility is at the core of what the initial point of the magazine was. If everyone had the patience and capacity to read the Financial Times every day, the world wouldn't be the way it is. But ultimately, when people work in jobs that require them to be there for hours and hours, might have childcare responsibilities, just other things to do, free time is a commodity that unfortunately working class people have less of. So, there'd be no point making content, to liberate those people if it wasn't suited to their lifestyles.
I so
Definitely.
agree with that. I so agree with that. Like sometimes news platforms are so like conceited in their like their conveying of news and the way they tell the news and even sometimes the language that they're using, and it really does alienate people who need to be knowing actually what's going on, what is this news story about. So I really do appreciate that Sludge Mag does that. Martin, we were talking just now about like the importance of independent media. Um, do you think, given kind of the current political climate in the UK and certain censorship laws that are being rumored to be ratified sometime in the future, like how they've been saying we're not going to be able to criticize the government, blah, 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 blah.
Mm.
Given the direction that the UK is likely going in or might be going in or whatever, where do you see Sludge Mag and in general independent media fitting into that story?
I think that's where support for independent media becomes super important, because
Mhm.
the kind of movement has enough support behind it, then attempts to quash it will be critiqued more. If there's a news source where people get their news frequently and are really engaged with and really passionate about, then any government attempts to suppress that platform would generate a lot of uproar and dissidence. In terms of where we'll go, what exactly will happen, I don't know. It
Yeah.
doesn't fill me with massive optimism, but neither does anything about British politics as such. You just almost have to ignore it, kind of thing. Cross that bridge when you come to it.
Thinking about the layperson out there who maybe has gone their whole life kind of following what they've been told, listening to the news, etc., and now might be listening to this and thinking, okay, maybe in the future, seeing the way that things are going, I do want to engage with independent media. However, I'm concerned about the validity and fake news, etc., given that given that independent media, obviously, a lot of the time is coming from I wouldn't say non-verified source, but obviously it's not from an official body per se. So what would you say to them if people are feeling kind of a bit cautious about engaging with this and like they're maybe a bit like, how do I know whether this is true or not, sort of thing?
First and foremost, I'd salute them, because that concern demonstrates that they're using critical thinking, which is fantastic. In terms of Sludge Mag, although we're not, let's say, ratified by a government body, with most if not all of our posts, you can see where the statistic comes from. So if you post something about homelessness or poverty or rising numbers of homelessness or poverty, there's always a link or reference to the survey body which we would have got that information from. Whether you're interacting with Sludge Mag or another platform, I'd say when people make claims, particularly statistics, just be sure to check where the source is. The other thing I'd say is that whilst I understand people's yearning for validity, most bodies that sort of ratify information are unified by one thing, which is having proved to actually lie. As yet, it's not even proven that Sludge Mag have intentionally published something which is completely untrue. In Britain, think how many newspapers would have reported that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, for example.
Trust me, dog. That's what I was gonna say when Carlos was just saying now about like certified bodies. I was gonna be like, if that even means anything,
If we go through the certified bodies, if you look at platforms like Twitter or Facebook, for example, admittedly he's banned now, but the verified president of the United States took to these social media platforms to claim election fraud.
Exactly.
If you think about domestic terrorism in this country, a lot of it comes from reputable newspapers stirring up anti-migrant feeling and referring to them as slaves or swarms or cockroaches and things like that. So I'd say, yeah, to answer the question in two parts. One, in terms of statistics, check where they're substantiated from, and in terms of the validity of bodies, I just would wonder where the trust in establishment media emanates from.
Everyone just act through your own discretion, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? Do check everything yourself, do your own research.
Just because I think a good rule for media and life in general is that if someone says something that seems contentious, think what they have to gain from lying, for example.
Wow.
So if you get an issue like climate change, some people, you know, who are reasonable believe in climate change. A lot of the people who dispel the gravity of climate change typically, you know, conservative people have a lot of money to be made through deregulated labour markets, deforestation, tax breaks for oil companies, that sort of thing. So I think just as a general rule for life, if we're not sure if someone's telling the truth, kind of think what would incentivise them to lie.
Yeah.
And if that's just nothing, then they're probably telling the truth.
To round off the show, I thought we should probably talk about the reasons why it's important to actually support independent media. We've talked about the importance of it in terms of itself as an entity, and we've talked about how people can go about like supporting Sludge Mag through contributing pieces to it or becoming a member and supporting it financially. But why do you believe that it is actually so important for the public to support independent media?
Just referring back to a video we dropped either last week or earlier this week, people assume that the media they receive is made for the purpose of informing them, and for the most part, it isn't. It's made to make money. So whether it be producers trying to, you know, create viral moments so that they can charge more ad revenue, or whether it's to get the public to support certain things because it makes certain people money, that's how most of our media works. So just a quick example, think about the past 6 months, I think it is, of the, I don't want to say conflict, of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Every kind of mainstream media outlet seems to be unified in the idea that filling Ukraine with Western arms is the best thing to do. It's not that I don't think it is, and of course Ukraine have a right to defend themselves and they should be aided in doing that. But a lot of people don't know that some really big platforms are also funded by weapons companies. So whether it's the best thing to do or it's not the best thing to do in terms of what will actually help the people of Ukraine or Europe or the world or whoever, it's going to be pitched that way because it will make a lot of money for shareholders who are paying them to say that. So if you think alternatively about independent media platforms, if they're funded solely by the public, then the only people we answer to is the public. So anything that's put out would be in the public interest. Of course, we have our political subjectivities and we make no apologies for that, and we try to be very transparent about what that is, so that if it's not something someone ideologically aligns with, you know, they shouldn't invest in it. But for people who do, they can at least rest assured that anything they, you know, read from us will be created solely with their interest in mind.
I think that's a really good way of putting that, and I think I hope that that has been understood by people as well, because I think a lot of people out there will think, why do I need, like, there's no need for independent media when I can literally just go on to Google and search for the major news outlet or company, etc. But I think what you've just said obviously covers why it's so important that we do have alternative independent media sources out there, and they're only going to continue to be a thing if they're able to survive, and they're not going to survive without people's support. So
I think another example that maybe hits closer to home, if we just look domestically in Britain, most people who are journalists or editors or who work in the media sphere are middle to upper class. So their experiences of things like austerity or COVID or the cost of living crisis are going to be vastly different to the average working class person. And by different, I mean not as bad. So someone whose experience of austerity is not going on holiday as much isn't going to write about something with the same severity as someone who's suffered austerity through not eating with the experience. So there's going to be an obvious chasm between reality and how stories are pitched. When you support independent media, which is committed to amplifying voices from diverse backgrounds, whether that be racially or from a social economic perspective, you're more likely to get a true to life reflection of events. just by virtue of it not being gatekept, so that people being affected by socio-economic events don't have a voice, which is how establishment media has been organised for that very purpose.